Thank you very much for the introductions. I don't know if this is loud enough. Is this? Okay. I'm hoping the microphones will be ready. Yes. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity. For the opportunity to be here and to give this talk, and I would like to thank Dr. Kaftarian for doing this with me and for being one of the organizers of the events. My part of the talk is a historical overview of the women's question, namely the cultural and socio-economic changes that have had an impact on the perceived and actual roles of women in the society. In Armenia, most conversations... Oh.
The buzzing is gone, but that's...
Is it gone again? Good. Yeah. Well,
yeah. Good. Do you still hear the noise?
No.
Bring the podium closer.
Sorry about that.
Well, in Armenia, most conversations about gender equality and women's rights often get easily blocked with statements that feminism is a foreign borrow. That feminism is a European borrow and not authentic to the Armenian culture. The assumption is that Armenians have lived for centuries in a particular order of gender relations, which we have inherited from our ancestors and successfully transmitted through generations. Similar arguments are easy to block with references to the 19th century. And I want to show. For example, this could be a good example to show that feminism is not new in the Armenian society. It's not a new term, and it has been debated since mid-19th century. What you see here is a copy of Guitar, magazine Guitar, which was published in Constantinople in 1962 by Elvis Kesaretsian, who was the first female editor, and this was the first female magazine to be published by an Armenian woman and in the Ottoman Empire, all of Ottoman Empire. So here, the discussions of women's role this is the first time that we see the discussions of women's role and the first calls for women to take more active role in the society. This might not be termed as feminism in the way that we understand feminism and women's rights right now, but in the context at the time when this was done, this was very progressive, 1862, in an Islamic context, a woman publishing a magazine and calling on more active roles on the part of women in the society. And truly, in the context of the 19th century, just to give a historical overview, we do see that women's question with the awakening and all the reform that was taking place in the Armenian society, both in the Ottoman and in the Russian empires, we see that women's rights are being advocated and the change in the status of women is being discussed and debated. In the periodical press, but also legally, steps were being taken to address women's rights. I have a citation here from the National Constitution, the Ottoman Armenian National Constitution of 1863, that quote, "It is the obligation of the nation to spread education to boys and girls equally." This was the first time when girls' education was legally made important and was recognized as mandatory if we were to have because it was believed that without educated mothers, it was not possible to have a progressive society. But also Grigorotian, who was a co-author of the Armenian Constitution, but also later of the Ottoman Turkish Constitution, was also propagating and advocating women's rights in the newspaper. And I have a citation here from Byzantium, who quote, "History shows a tight link between the issue of women's emancipation and nation's civilization. It is the odds and ends of old barbarity preserved in contemporary societies that put restrictions on women's destiny. Laws must be changed. A woman has to have equal rights. The rights of one sex should not be the deprivation for the other sex. And this was in 1870. I will not be talking much about what women achieved in the course of the 19th century, but just briefly I will mention, because there is not enough time to cover that, but briefly I will mention that the progress was enormous in the field of education. Women were first educated, and then they established organizations and opened up schools for girls, both in Constantinople and in the provinces. By educating women, they also were trying to open up jobs for women, because it was believed that only through financial independence women could achieve actual emancipation. This was the time also when women entered the paid labor outside the household. And they, of course, picked up also public roles that they had hitherto not had access to, by organizing charity, or in the peaceful times, and in times of unrest, also taking care of the orphans, the widowed women. When we entered the First Republic already, we know this, and we're very proudly often mention this, that Armenians were the first women in the world to, not the first, but among the first to get voting rights. And this was in a situation when there was no suffrage movement in the Armenian history. In Armenian women's history, there was no suffrage movement. They were granted the right to vote with the establishment of the First Republic in 1918. And Armenia was the first country to appoint a female ambassador, Diana Akbar, whose picture you see here. She was appointed to ambassador, she was stationed in Japan, and she was the first female ambassador in the world. When we entered in 1920, when Soviet rule was established in Armenia, this nationalist ideology, the national idea of what real women's roles should be in a real Armenian society, were given up for Marxist ideology. In Marxist theory and Marxist ideology, women are approached as a class. Women's issues are regarded to be class issues, and women were promised that with the fall of with the revolution, they would get rights, their chains would break, and they would get off the domestic burden, and would be active participants in the social sphere. And I'm quoting from Vladimir Lenin here: the experience of all liberation movements has shown that the success of a revolution depends on how much women take part in it. The Soviet government is doing everything in its power to enable women to carry on independent proletarian socialist work. So what were the Soviets actually doing for women? The Soviets started, of course, a very brutal industrialization policy, and they needed more labor. They needed more labor power. So women were mobilized, millions of women were mobilized in the workplace in the territory of Soviet Union, and so also in Armenia, especially in Yerevan. Yerevan was not well populated, so women's labor became essential for the industrialized and urbanized society that the Soviets envisioned. Zhenadzel's women's departments, Kin Horutner in Armenian, opened up, which brought women into politics. But also by bringing them into politics, these women were expected to educate the others and encourage them to enter the workplace. Because workplace, it wasn't easy to push women, because for decades they had been used to staying at home and doing, even if they had to earn money, most of them preferred doing it in the household through needlework. So this was something very new, women in a factory. Abortion was legalized in 1920 because the less children women had, the more likely they were to stay in the factories. And divorce was simplified so much so that in 1926 it was possible to get divorced through sending a postcard and also get a response through mail. And civil registration of marriage was introduced. Unregistered relationships had the same legal status as registered marriages. And this again was done to decenter the family because work was what was important. And it wasn't going to stay like this always with the socioeconomic changes. Communal kitchens were established when housed in the urban settings, including in Yerevan. The house planning included no kitchens. This meant that several apartments had to share one kitchen, and this was done with the purpose that women would share the cooking responsibilities amongst each other, and so they would have more time to spend in the factories or at the workplace. Daycare and kindergartens were established, including long, big units next to the factories where women could take their newborns with them to these factories and take breaks to nurse them as they worked. It was believed that, the quote is from a poster, all children are children of the state, so the state had to take care of the children. Libraries and intensive education units opened for women because most of these women were also uneducated and they needed to get educated as they were being mobilized into the workforce. And here's a poster which in Russian says that asks this rhetoric question: what did the October Revolution give to the working class woman and to the peasant? And the buildings that the woman is showing is the library, the maternity homes, schools, kindergartens, clubs for working class women, and all these wonderful things that women were supposed to be addressing women's rights, but in fact they were not. And Lenin in 1922 stated that the position of women furnishes a particularly graphic elucidation of the difference between bourgeois and socialist democracy. In no bourgeois republic, nowhere in the world, not even in the most advanced country, have women gained a position of complete equality. And this was also voiced by Armenian newspapers. And here I have the cover of a magazine that started to be published in Armenia in 1924, Hayastani Ashkhatavoruhi, working women of Armenia. And the cover, you can see the urban woman handing a book handing the magazine to the rural woman, which was also a task that they had to take on their shoulders, educating the peasant women. And here, in the first paragraph, you can read that nowhere, again, they're backing up what Lenin was basically saying, that nowhere in the world women benefited the most from the establishment of Soviet Union because the women in the Soviet Union have equal rights with men. And this poster here claims that with every day, it's more and more joyful, life gets more and more joyful. But was it? So the household slavery, this domestic slavery that Lenin claimed that revolution was going to take care of, never ended. Because the double burden did stay. Cooking was not the only responsibility that women had. They had to come home and do the domestic labor. And although women's work is generally regarded a progressive step, and there's been a movement for that, there's been a fight for that, this mobilization was based on coercion rather than opportunity or choice. So women were not asked if they wanted to work, and many of them did not, because they knew that they would end up with a double burden. There was a housing crisis in 1970. 23% of households were made up of 3 generations living in the same house. Easy divorce was not actually a good thing for women, especially the less unskilled and less educated, the less skilled and less educated, because that getting easily divorced, they would lose the person who was supposed to take care of them. Women's movements were abolished because it was believed that the women's question had been solved, it had found its solution, so there was no more any reason or any necessity to have women's movements. But this, in fact, gave women no way of addressing the issues if they had them. Further reinforce the sex segregation, gender segregation in the job market. Yeah, it's not louder. Yeah. Women's the sex segregation that existed in the employment.
I think it's not working. It seems very.
Yeah, I think it's back now. Yeah, it's better. The sex segregation on the job market was growing. By 1970s, 98% of nurses, 75% of teachers, 95% of librarians were women. The situation changed in 1930s and 1940s with the rapid industrialization. The ruble, Russian ruble, there was a rehabilitation of the Russian ruble. So that also meant that women's labor was not as important as it used to be.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Bring the podium. Apparently the cord is not long enough.
Try to speak louder. Let's see.
Yes, I'm doing it. Okay. So new legislation in 1936 was introduced to reinforce the traditional role of the family. Now women had to be sent home because the economy was doing better. Unregistered marriages were no longer recognized. Motherhood was declared a patriotic duty, and medals were distributed to women who had more children, including any kind of reward, going with rewards. Divorce became more difficult to obtain, especially after 1944. Legal abortions were abolished, except on health concerns, and this wasn't to be restored until 1955. And in 1934, homosexuality and prostitution were declared crimes with penalties of 8 years of imprisonment. During the wartime, of course, women were again pushed to the workplace when men were in the front lines. But situation changed in 1950s and 1970s when the economy grew by 10 to 11%. There were some improvements in the living standards of women. Retirement age was defined at 55 for women and 60 for men. There was more presence of women in the higher education. In 1956, Khrushchev again re-established women's councils, with the purpose of increasing women's political participation. Economic growth, however, fell to 3% in 1970s, and the birth rates also fell. So that meant that women were again pushed home to give birth and stay out of the job market, leaving the job to the men. The perestroika, the Gorbachev, the final years before the fall of the Soviet Union, the Gorbachev era, again, we know that this was the hardest economic time when a lot of the factories shut down, and so did also the childcare. No childcare was no longer provided to women, and women were among the first to be laid off. On TVs, you could see a course on ethics of family, and this was also taught at schools, and a new type of Soviet family started to be propagated. And I'm quoting Gorbachev from The New Thinking for Our Country and the World, published in 1988. Women no longer have enough time to perform their everyday duties at home, housework, the upbringing of children, and the creation of a good family atmosphere. We have discovered that many of our problems in children's and young people's behavior, in our morals, culture, and in production are partially caused by the weakening of family ties and slack attitudes of family responsibilities. we should make it possible for women to return to their pure mission. Okay. So several factors in the post-Soviet period, several factors will influence the new national identity. The collapse of the Soviet identity, that was not so based on national identity, but it was a collective identity of Soviet people. The Karabakh conflict, mass migration, and the revival of a system of traditional values. Such as, because women were pushed into the work, they didn't in the beginning of the 1920s, now staying home meant being a working class woman, being a working woman was considered to be not a national thing, and so women were pushed again home and encouraged to stay home and not work. Family ties were strengthened, and I'm quoting here from Maro Matosyan, cited in Ani Gilosyan's study. The harsh socioeconomic conditions worked to further strengthen family ties. The family came to be perceived as the last stronghold of a very violent, changed and uprooted society. And you can see this very clearly, especially on women's participation, political participation, when in 1885, 121 out of 219 were women. But in 1991, only 8 women were introduced to the parliament, and this was done artificially by the then mayor Vano Siraderian. A group of a women's party was established with the controversial name Shamiram, and these women became the first deputies of the post-Soviet Armenia, independent Armenia. But even in the words of Vano Siraderian, our ladies should decorate the parliamentary hearings with their presence. So there was nothing about women's rights at all. On the contrary, this was a very patriarchal approach. In 1997, there were only 4 women in the Armenian parliament, and in 2012, 14 out of 131 were women, and that's after the 20% quota was introduced. And I will here speak a little bit about women in the job market and women and gender-based violence, and then I will pass it to Dr. Kaftarian. Vast majority of women today in Armenia, vast majority of women are in administrative or service sector. Armenia has the biggest gender pay gap in the region, according to data of 2016. Majority of women are not full-time employees, and 86% of divorced women is unemployed, whereas only 13% of divorced men is unemployed. 69% of university graduates are women, but 75% of PhD candidates are men. According to World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap, which is an index designed to measure inequality between men and women, taking into account several categories such as economic participation, career opportunities, education, health, and political rights, Armenia ranked 84 in 2011, 103 in 2014, 105 in 2015, and 102 in 2017, out of 144 countries. Well, perhaps the most horrific thing that is happening right now in terms of women's rights and in terms of gender is the domestic violence. At least 50 women were killed by partners or family members between 2010 and 2017. Domestic violence is culturally accepted in the Armenian society by and large, and this is not a class issue. It's not that you can see it in upper classes, you can see it in lower classes, in middle classes, so this is not a class issue, unfortunately. So it's harder to target it when you don't know where to go after it. since 2009 to introduce a law which failed, and only last year, in December, end of last year, a domestic violence law was accepted after very controversial debates and very heated debates. But even then, they did manage to change the title from law on prevention of domestic violence and protection of victims of domestic violence. They changed it, the wording to, they added basically, and restoring harmony in the family, which is problematic because it still means that they're going to make the effort for reconciliation in a family that where domestic violence is common. The other, again, one of the other biggest problems gender-based, in terms of gender-based violence, is the sex-selective abortions that is being much talked now about because it really is becoming a demographic disaster. Armenia ranked third with high rate of masculine births after India and China. Armenia's sex ratio is 114 to 100 between 2008 and 2012 versus the biologically defined level of 105 boys to 100 girls. And in Gerarkunik region, this is the highest. 124 boys are born to every 100 girls. Every year, 1,400 girls, female fetus is being basically killed through abortions. UN Population Fund supported the law in August 2016. Now the woman going through to abortion is given a 3-day waiting period. There's a mandatory counseling. However, this is not criminalized, and what is discouraging is that gender gets lost in these debates. So it is not always clear that this is done because you should not stop the baby from being born because it's a woman. This is done. This is interpreted in the general line of abortion is not good. Which is again can at some point become a violation of women's rights rather than help them. So the fact, the real issue that these abortions are happening because women and girls do not have value in the Armenian culture, and this is what has to be fought against, this is not being raised. So the law is in fact not doing much work. And I want to quote, because we talked about Soviet times, with Trotsky and pass it to Dr. Kaftarian, that how many men enslaved women, how the exploiters subjected them both, how toilers have attempted at the price of blood to free themselves from slavery and have only exchanged one chain for another. History tells us much about all this. In essence, it tells us nothing else, but how in reality to free the child, the woman, and the human being. For that, we have as yet no reliable models. But I am hoping that today we will come up with some.